Hello, my name is Robert Walker. I'm an accountant and an insolvency practitioner. This is the fifth in my series on the topic of managing insolvency in troubled times. In this session I am going to deal with the other three methods of dealing with insolvency, having dealt with liquidation in the previous session. The three further methods are receivership, voluntary administration and informal or bilateral arrangements. Receivership. Now, it always amuses me when I hear the media say that the directors called in the receivers into a company. Directors very rarely call in receivers. Indeed, they're not empowered to do that. The person who is empowered to appoint a receiver is a secured creditor, usually a bank. What does it? What basis is there for a bank or some other secured creditor to appoint a receiver? It is generally a contract. The contract will be a loan contract supported by some kind of security agreement, and the security agreement will confer upon the bank the right to take possession of the property to which the property is subject, and they can therefore appoint a receiver to that property. If the property is so fundamental to the business, or it is the business itself, then the receiver will take control of the whole business. Whilst receivers are generally appointed by way of contract, they are still subject to a statutory regime. It's a much briefer regime than the Companies Act, and it's called the Receiverships Act of 1993. Now, receivers can invoke compromise, they can invoke hive down, as I described in the session on liquidation, but of course they don't do that. They probably don't need to. They will almost invariably control the business. Indeed, it may be the subject of the security agreement which has empowered them, and they can operate the business, or they can dismantle the business, or they can sell it, operate for the purpose of selling. Now, they're not going to do that lightly. Once they start operating, they are the ones responsible for any further debts that are incurred, and they're not likely to take the risk if they don't have a deep-pocketed creditor standing behind them, such as a bank. Okay, what is exactly the nature of the security agreements? Well, there are three in number. There are real estate mortgages, but that's not likely to be the basis to a receivership. What are likely to be the basis to a receivership are documents that arise in the context of the Personal Property Securities Act of 1999, and they'll be one of two sorts. They will be specific security agreements which will identify a specific asset, saying that car, that machine, or whatever. Then there are general security agreements. Those general security agreements will say that the creditor has the right to all present and after acquired property, meaning everything in a business essentially. Because the general security agreements are so widely cast, the receiver controls the business by that means. And indeed, those security agreements will almost certainly confer upon the receiver the management rights. Otherwise, the receiver has to go to court to exercise it, which used to be the case, but now they simply anticipate that. Receivers have to be independent in the same way as liquidators, and in the near future they'll be drawn only from a limited pool of people subject to the regulation of insolvency practitioners. Before I leave the issue of receivership, I would just identify that secured creditors also pop up in compromise. They're frequently there, and they have to be dealt with especially, right? They hold the rights to the property in the same way. A compromise doesn't change that, and so they have to be accommodated. Now, I'll move to the subject of voluntary administration. Voluntary administration was introduced about 15 years ago. I don't agree with it because I don't think it's necessary. It, like compromise, is a business but rehabilitation scheme. Okay, it is very formal and complex, and therefore it's expensive. It runs for about 65 pages of the Companies Act, whereas compromise runs for 7, and that you can see from there that there's quite significant difference in the scale of complexity. There are other differences or technical differences from administration to compromise. An administrator must be a formal appointment, and there's a formal appointment process. Creditors' claims are stayed, similar to Chapter 11 in the United States, with the exception it's time limited. It's not unending like it is in Chapter 11, which is quite good. And the reason that creditors' claims are stayed is it enables the administrator to put together the proposal for continuing the business or discontinuing it, which is then put to a vote of creditors, and they decide whether to continue it or not. As far as I'm concerned, that level of complexity is only applicable to large businesses. Indeed, I listened to a turnaround specialist from America at the time of the introduction of this law, and he said you never contemplate Chapter 11 in the United States unless the enterprise has revenues in excess of $1 billion, and he meant US, and it's probably gone up since then. Okay, so we really see voluntary administration, but I suspect we'll see it again in the near future as large enterprises begin to falter. Now, what's also important about voluntary administration is a vote. Now, it does not need unanimity. What it requires is only a supermajority of creditors to agree. This is referred to, and I'll introduce this concept now, it's referred to as a cram down. What it means is that a 75% majority of creditors can impose their will on a discordant minority of creditors. So if 25% of the creditors don't wish to approve a proposal, they can be upvoted. So creditors' rights are not absolute. They're strong, but they're not absolute. That is also a feature of compromise, which is why I mention the subject now. I'd also just identify that our law came from Australia and mainly. The Australians have a phenomenon that are called prepacks. What it means is that all of the detail of the compromise is arranged in advance before the administrator is even appointed. And so it's presented to the creditors as a fait accompli. Now, often that can be an entirely benign thing, and that it requires a lot of organisation, a lot of persuasion. To have a completely worked out plan in advance is probably an advantage. But just be aware that it's sometimes used to hoodwink creditors. So it has got a bit of a bad name. Of course, if you're confronted as a creditor with a voluntary administration that's a prepack and you can see that it's dubious, there's probably little you can do about it other than to try and vote it down and make sure that the company goes into liquidation, because of course if the proposals fail, companies go into liquidation. Voluntary administration was greeted with enthusiasm at the outset, but it died away for the reasons I've given, which are that it is not particularly appropriate to small and medium-sized businesses, and large businesses haven't been failing in the last 15 years. Before I move to the final method of dealing with insolvency, please note that both receivers and administrators have the same obligation to report crimes as does a liquidator. Now, whether that's a factor in decision making is over to directors, not me. The final method you might attempt in dealing with insolvency is to engage in informal or bilateral arrangements. I mean informal in that it's not couched in a statutory context. It's bilateral in the sense that it is from the insolvent to each individual creditor. And you may wish to engage in restructuring of a debt. Now, if it's done with a bank, it's more than likely to be able to work, because the bank will continue a flow of cash, which would mean that the other creditors will get paid in part and will likely go along with it. But if it's just an ordinary creditor, then it is almost certain to be doomed to failure, because bilateral arrangements don't in any way affect a creditor's right to take enforcement action of their own, and that will often happen. It bilateral agreements only bind one creditor, not all of them. Which then brings me to the issue of compromise. One of its main advantages is that it is a multilateral reconstruction, and we'll go into the detail as to how that happens. That's one of its main advantages. The other is that it is inexpensive, which would be in contrast to receivership and involuntary administration, because it can be carried out by a director themselves. Please, if you wish for written material, look below the video and you will find ways to acquire it. Thank you very much. Bye.